everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you how to make these Tim Holtz inspired vintage frames for your journaling. And later in the video I will be sharing a free SVG file and where you can find that, so be sure to stick around. So a while back I was in the store and I found these really great frames. These are from the Tim Holtz line, Ideology. They're really great. However, I didn't buy them. I thought I can make something that looks very similar to this and do it with things I already have at home. So I went ahead and put these back. However, if you do like them, I will leave a link to them down below so you can purchase them. But if you want to learn how to DIY some of your own, let's get started. So I am starting off by creating a masterboard. This is just a big sheet of collage. I am using watercolor paper as my backing for this, so it's going to be a little bit thicker. This is about 300 GSM. It is a very, very thick paper. And what I'm going to do is start overlaying old book pages that I am ripping up. These books are old books that I have bought from Goodwill and those kind of places for very cheap. They're all different colors, and I'm using a glue stick to put them down. I like to start off with my largest sheets and then slowly go down to smaller ones and then kind of stack them on top of each other, kind of breaking up the areas where I feel there's too much of the same color. The great thing about book pages, depending on how old the book is, how it's manufactured, what kind of paper is used, all the book pages are going to be different colors, and that is great. So I started off with a lighter one. Here I've got a little bit more of a vintage one with some browning on the edges. I'm using straight edges along the straight edges. That just makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to do that. You can use scraps here and just glue those down and then trim it out later on. I'm also using a glue stick to put this down. The less glue, the better at this point. You want it to be a strong glue. You want it to stay firmly to that paper. However, you don't want a thick layer of anything where you're going to have to cut through it later. So I like to use a glue stick. It's strong enough to hold down the paper, but it's easy enough to cut through later on. Now, another thing, I am using old book pages here to create my masterboard. I will layer on some things later on. However, for the most part, it is book pages, old music sheets, that kind of thing. If you notice in the Tim Holtz frames, they are all different kinds of papers. You can print off different papers, you can use pictures, you can use pattern paper, any sort of thing you want, and just layer them up. This is kind of the beauty of making them yourself. You can tailor it to fit your style or your project. So if you love more of a cutesy theme, go for polka dots and stripes and that kind of thing. If you want a more vintage theme, you can do what I'm doing here. You can layer up old specimen papers, those types of things. So color coordinate, have fun, play around, and just make it your own. This is also a great way to use up scraps. I'm using up a ton of scraps from my scrap box here in this project. And as I get to the smaller pieces, your fingers are going to get a little sticky with all the glue. I like to use a brayer to really push it down and secure it to the paper. And it's not going to leave any glue marks from my fingers on the front of it. So I like to switch to a brayer to push these down later on. Now, once I have this completely filled up with all my different bits and papers and I am happy with the way it looks, I need to set it aside and let it dry. Now from that point, you can leave it as is. If this is the look you're going for, great. It's done. You're ready to go. If you want to use different pattern papers and just strictly do that, you're good to go. It's ready to go. But I'm going to add a few more layers to create a little bit more interest on this background. So I am just going to let it dry for a few seconds, let that glue set up, and then I will come back in and add my next layers. So my next layer will be some coffee. Off to the right hand side, I have a little bit of water with instant coffee mixed in. I am going to use that along with an empty jar to create some rings like you would see if you had a wet bottom to your cup and you set it down. So I'm just dipping that jar into my coffee and then letting it rest on my paper for just a little bit. You don't want to pick it right back up. It's not going to leave as dark of a mark, and it's going to get a little sloppy. Let it soak into the paper like it would if you set your cup down to rest. And then as you pull it up, you might get a little splattering here and there. That's okay. The great thing about this masterboard is it is going to eventually be cut up into smaller pieces. So I don't need to worry so much about the spacing here. It's all going to be cut up and kind of dismembered, if you will. So I'm just going to add a few splotches here and there. I might overlap a few, and then I'm actually going to switch to a smaller cup and create some smaller circles on this paper as well. You can do whatever you want. You can do like I'm doing here and create some nice splotches. You can go in and just do splatters if you want. You could go in and just drop really large droplets and splatters throughout this if you wanted to. It really is up to you. I am just decorating this as I want to. While this is still wet, I am going to start flicking on some coffee as well. So I'm just going to take the bottom of the jar, and instead of getting a paintbrush dirty, I'm just going to get it nice and wet and then flick it onto the paper. I'll add a few more splotches here and there, but for the most part, I'm just going to tap the jar and throw it down and let it land where it may. This is going to create some nice splattering effects. It'll blend into some of the areas where there is already wet. It's just a fun little thing to add. And before the coffee fully has a chance to dry, I am going to start splattering on some inks as well. These are the liquid watercolors, the PH Martins, I believe they are. I'll leave a link to them down below. I love to use these because once they are on the paper and they are dry, they are staying. They can't be reactivated. So if I go in later and decide to coffee dye something, these aren't going to move. It's going to stay where it is. They won't bleed. I'm starting off with some black, and I will eventually come in with a few more colors. I'm using a larger brush just to splatter this on. The great thing about brushes, you can hold them closer to the paper and get some really big splatters. You can hold them further away and get some smaller ones. You can just smush the paintbrush down and get some nice big marks on the paper as well, which I did a few times too. You will notice that if you are using some vintage papers and some newer papers, on the vintage papers, it's going to bleed a little bit more. The fibers are looser. They're going to let that ink bleed a little bit further than the newer papers might. Also, as you're creating your collage, think about the texture of your paper you're putting down. So on all of these papers, I did not put down any paper that had a slick surface. I knew that I wanted to do some splattering, to do some coffee staining, those kinds of things. So I knew I wanted the paper to be able to absorb the liquid. If you put down a paper with a coating, it's not going to do that, or not near as much. It's going to stay on top, it's going to smear. So think about what you want to do to your paper. The coated papers are great to use sometimes. I just didn't use them here because I knew I wanted to add some inks. After I got the black on there, I switched to a pink color. So I started thinking about my color scheme a little more. I'm using some browns, some blacks, some darker pinks. I mixed in a little bit of the black with that pink just to tone it down a little bit. That's something I like to do when I'm working with more of a vintage look. Add a little black, add a little brown. It's going to tone down those brighter colors. And you're starting to see some of those colors start to blend and mix into each other. This is where it starts to become really unique. Now I also came in with a little bit of blue, and my PH Martins do not have any muted colors in it. It only has the brown and the black, and you have some white. So you really have to mix these and create your own colors. So what I like to do is I have my water in my little well. I'll put down a drop of the color I want, and the water thins it out a little bit because these are very concentrated. You do not need more than literally a drop of it. I started with a little bit of teal. I added a little bit of the blue because I knew I wanted it to turn a little bit more blue. And then I'm going to mix in a little bit of the black. I won't get any more out of the bottle. I'm just going to simply move that over. It will all start to mix together and it will darken that up, mute it down a little bit so it's not quite so vibrant. You'll also notice that I changed the brush I'm working with. I'm now using a fan brush. This is going to create some really fine splattering. So switch up the brushes you're using. For the black, I used a thicker brush. I used the same one for the pink. However, I held that further away from the paper so the splatter was finer. For the blue, I am using the fan brush. That's going to give me some really fine but concentrated spatter. And then as I get closer to the end, I will actually use the fan brush to create a few stripes on the paper too. So just different things you can do with the brushes, different looks you can get. And again, you're going to be cutting this up. So don't look at it as a whole because I've got a lot of coffee stains right next to each other. I get it's a lot, but it's going to be dissected here shortly. So I set that aside, let it completely dry. The color's muted down a little bit. I absolutely love the way this turned out, but I'm going to add a few little more things. The first thing is going to be these vintage stamps. These are not true vintage stamps. These are ones I have printed off that are free from the internet. I will leave the sheet that I've kind of created for myself over on my blog. And I actually use thinning shears to cut these out. It gives it a true stamp look. I will have a video up shortly on a short actually on how you do that. It's very, very simple. All you need is a pair of thinning shears that you would use like for hair cutting, but you're just going to use them on paper. It's a pretty cool little technique. So these are just printed off onto some regular old computer paper. I've cut them out. I've also dipped them in some of the splatters as they were drying on the paper, so some of them have a few splatters as well. Also, some of the areas aren't quite dry, so those are going to bleed through the stamps and create almost a shadow effect. It's a really cool thing to do. Again, I'm not really worried about putting them too close together. These are going to be cut up. You're going to get parts of them on some of the pieces. Some of them might be whole, some of them might be cut in half, some you might just have a sliver. So I'm not going to worry about it so much. I'm just going to space them kind of evenly. I'm also going to add a little bit of this vintage tape that I DIY'd. This is very simple to do. Again, I'll have a video on it shortly, but I'm just tearing up strips of that and putting it down. I will say my method of making the tape is a little bit different than other ones I've seen online. I like to use what I have on hand. I don't have alcoholic inks on hand, and the smell of them gives me a headache, so I don't ever plan on having them. So I used what I had and I made it myself. So this is a lot of fun to use, and it's kind of a never-ending supply because I can always make more, which is great. I don't feel like I have to hoard it. So I'm tearing strips of that and placing it down here and there. I'll overlap it with some of the stamps. I'll place it on some parts that are hanging so it kind of looks like it's holding those on. I'm turning them, some of them horizontally, some of them vertically. Again, not really worrying about where the other ones are. This is all going to be cut up. Now, once I have this the way I want it, it is ready to go. The next thing that we are going to do is start cutting it up. But if you are in love with your masterboard and you can't imagine cutting it up, that's okay. Don't. Take a picture, scan it, do something along those lines. Save this board that you have made and then print off the picture and use that. It's that simple. You don't have to cut it up if you don't want to. Earlier, while my masterboard was drying, I went over to my cutting machine and I cut out a bunch of these frames. These are ones that I have created myself. I drew them myself, and I will put this SVG PNG up on my blog for free. I am just going to be using the 6 to the left. I am not actually using that film strip. It's still in there. You can cut it. You can size these however you want. I will mention that I did cut them out from a little bit thicker chipboard just to give them some heft. I am already putting this on the back of a heavyweight cardstock, that watercolor paper. It's 300 GSM. This is going to add a little bit more heft. If you don't have any of this, use a heavyweight cardstock, double it up. But you want a little bit of bulk of to these. You don't want them super thin. So I cut out 2 of each design, and now it's going to be time to start gluing them on the back of the masterboard. There you can see a little bit more of that thickness. Not super heavyweight, but a little bit more stability than a normal heavyweight cardstock. And here's the thing. I only made 1 masterboard. I am not going to scan mine or take any pictures. I'm going to glue this directly onto the back of it. That paper is a really heavy weight. I like that. I like the sturdiness it gives me, but I don't want to waste any of the paper. So before I do any gluing, I am going to lay them out. And you'll see here, I am layering up some inside the others. Those squares inside, that's going to be wasted space. So I like to layer in another frame inside of that. You'll also see at the end of this video, I will not let those squares inside that are rather large go to waste. Those will get cut out again and again until I can't do any more frames from them. It's very simple to do with a ruler and a craft knife, not super hard, and it's a great way to make the most of this. I'm also putting the frames fairly close together. I'm not leaving a whole lot of gap room. All I need to be able to do is fit in a craft knife through the center of, or through those lines. So I don't need that much space between them. Once I have these arranged to where I am wasting the least amount of this paper as I can, I'm going to start gluing them down. I'll only take off one at a time so I don't lose the placement. And I am using some liquid glue here. This is the Eileen's Tack It Over and Over. You can use Fabri-Tac. You can use a regular white PVA glue. It really is up to you. What I will say though is I put down a little bit of this glue and then I use a brush to thin it out. That's going to give me the strong hold that I'm looking for with this liquid adhesive without the bulk. So I'm not going to have any large lines of glue that will warp these frames in any way. Just gives a nice flat surface. So I use a brush, just an old one that I don't mind having to end up throwing away, to thin out that glue. And then I'll place something heavy like this acrylic block on top to let it dry nice and flat. That's going to keep the warping down to a minimum. Using any kind of liquid glue, you're almost asking for warping, especially with some of these smaller frames. But if you keep an acrylic block on top of them, spread the glue out, use a thinner layer, it's still going to be strong enough to hold them together. It should be just fine. You also want to make sure that you are spreading the glue from corner to corner, from side to side. These are going to eventually be cut out, and you're using this back frame as a guide. Your knife is going to be gliding along there. You want fully covered glue surface area so these don't end up peeling apart on you. I will add some sewing later on, which will help them stay together, but you want to make sure they have a good bond to begin with. And you don't need to leave that acrylic block on long. As I am going on to the next frame, I will put that down. I can move the acrylic block over. It doesn't take long for this glue to dry. And again, I am leaving very little space between these and through the bottom edge. I don't want to waste this paper at all, so I will just continue to go glue these down, make sure the acrylic block is on top to hold it down, and then I'll set it aside to dry for a while. Now, once it's fully dry, it's time to start cutting them out. You can use scissors to cut these out. I prefer a knife. I like these box cutters. They're very cheap at your local hardware store. They're nice and sharp. You can break the blades off as they get dull. You don't have to change out the whole blade. Really simple and easy to use. I prefer to use these. The great thing about using the thicker chipboard, that's going to give you a nice edge to butt that knife up against, so you don't even need to use a cutting guide. You have that paper to use. This slices through like butter. It just works really well. Even the center of these. I like to start off first by cutting the outside edges and getting the main bulk of the frame. But getting this away from that big piece of paper just makes turning it and cutting it so much easier. Something I didn't mention before too, whenever you are gluing down these frames, don't look at the front. Don't ever look at the front. Just flip it over, put your frames down, and cut it out. If you want to start in the top right corner, the top left corner, the bottom left, you want to start in the center, work your way out. However you do it, don't look. It always turns out so much better if you don't look and you just let them fall where they may. You could never try and get some of these cool pieces like cut where they do just by chance if you tried to do it on your own. Cutting out the inside of this frame can be a little bit more difficult. What I like to do is switch between one of these larger knives and a smaller one. And sometimes it's just those corners. So if you get everything up until that point, just pop it out. It will create a little bit of a mark, but just use a sanding block to kind of sand that down. Also, take your time, put on a movie, and just do this slowly. It's not a quick process, but I promise you it's worth it in the end. So I like to just take my time, slowly cut these out. Make sure that you are protecting your work surface underneath. You're using blades. So just have a cutting mat. I'm using my glass one. Underneath, you can use any cutting mat or cutting board you have on hand. It may also take a few passes. So just keep going over those areas. Using your knife until you feel it give. Some of the spots where I put the tape was a little bit harder to cut through. So depending on what you have put on your masterboard, how many layers you have, those kinds of things is going to depend on how many passes you have to take and how much force. I don't like to use a lot of force. I would rather use more passes. Once you get it apart though, I love the reveal. You have a little bit of the coffee. You've got a few bits of tape. You've got one whole piece of tape. But that's why I said don't ever look at where you're putting these. I couldn't have tried to get that look had I tried to put it just so on the piece of paper. Plus, you're going to waste more that way. I also like to keep the scraps. I know we're all guilty of it, but these are some pretty cool scraps to use later on in different projects. And if you just need a little piece, you'll have it. I like to keep a larger shoebox that I keep all of my scraps in. And a lot of times I dig from that first. Now here is a look at that second frame all cut out. This one's so neat too. I love the little bits and pieces that you are getting from it. The great thing about these, no two are going to be alike. Also, when you are using your own products that you already have on hand, you're going to coordinate them to your project so much better. Now, some of these have some larger frames, like the inside is quite large. I like to sit those off to the side and create more frames out of them. I just use a ruler and create lines on the back with a pen and then use my knife to cut along those lines. It's really, really simple. Once I have them all cut out though, this is how they look. They are so cool. I love the way they look. Here's one that I actually just used my ruler and a craft knife to cut that out. So if you don't have an electronic cutting machine and you can't cut out these frames, that's okay. You can create your own just by cutting out squares within squares within squares. It's really simple and easy to do. You do not need SVG files to do that. These can absolutely be done purely by hand. Now, if you will remember back to those very first pictures of the Tim Holtz ones, one thing they did have that mine don't have yet is some stitching. I didn't want to add stitching to all of these. These look great without it. However, on some of them I did. On the Tim Holtz ones, they are all straight stitched around the border. But I thought I would have some fun with it. I used white thread on all of them, but you could easily switch this out for gold, for red, for brown, whatever you would want to do. Again, it's great to coordinate to your taste or your project. So I used some of the larger frames and I did some stitching around them, and I used all different sorts of stitches. Those to the left that I'm showing you now, I did no stitching on. I kept them stitch free. But here on this one, I did a simple straight stitch around the border, very quick and easy. On this one, I did a little bit of a crow's foot stitch, it looks like. I don't know what you call these. Here, I did another stitch. Here, I did like all different waves, zigzags, if you will. Just a lot of different stitches, zigzags on this one. But I just kept it fun. I tried different stitches, did different designs on them, kind of made them my own. So each one is a little bit unique, a little bit different. I absolutely adore the way these turned out. And I can't wait to make more of these with different colors, different book pages, different printables, those kinds of things. A lot of fun. So many ways you can make this project your own and really customize it to your style, your liking, your project. And like I said, these can all be done by hand. However, if you do have an electronic cutting machine and you want those guides, those frames, they are available for free over on my blog. I will leave a link to that down in the description box below. So don't forget to check that out. Also in the description box below, you're going to find some supplies that I used today. Not a lot of them. A lot of this was already in my stash. But a few supplies listed down below, as well as the original Tim Holtz frames that inspired these. That is going to do it for me today. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Happy crafting, everyone.